quote-unquote anti-White, over half of them don't have a voter's card.
Sounds like Nigeria.
Join Ireti Bakare-Yusuf on Borderlines as she engages with policymakers and thought leaders,
giving you perspectives and insights you won't find anywhere else.
Be part of the conversation. Join us live.
Your voice matters on Borderlines as we explore the complexities.
Every Friday at 4 p.m.
on 99.3 Nigeria Info.
Stay informed, stay engaged.
Step into the conversation.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Borderlines, the only show that takes you beyond borders. I can see my guest, and he's become one of my favorite guests. But before I bring him on, and before I tell you who he is, he's been here before, and unlike a lot of UN peeps, he's not shy to tell us the truth. You know what I mean? So this year makes it 80 years, yes, 80 of the UN. It's a long history, but there's a short snippet that we want to play for you before I introduce my guest. I want you all to listen to it very carefully so that you are able to understand when I begin my conversation with one of the most distinguished guests we've had on this show. Please play.
In one of the busiest cities in the world, between In one of the busiest cities in the world, between iconic buildings and hot dog stands, sits the headquarters of an international organisation with one mission: world peace. I'm talking, of course, about the United Nations, or the UN for short. You've probably heard of it before. The UN first became a thing in 1945, just after the Second World War. The big Allied Four wanted to prevent another huge war from ever happening again, so they formed a new organisation designed to do just that.
San Francisco, California, a momentous conference begins. Here, leaders of the United Nations, representing all but a fraction of the Earth's population, are laying the foundations of international security in the post-war world.
On the 25th of April 1945, 850 representatives from 50 countries met in what was, at the time, the largest international gathering ever. The end result was this: the United Nations Charter. It's a legally binding contract between all the countries involved, and includes all the things the UN wants to achieve, like getting rid of poverty and disease, providing food and aid to those who need it, improving health services, disaster relief, protecting human rights, and making sure countries follow international laws.
First to sign is China.
On the 24th of July 1945, after a bunch of revisions, it was agreed upon and signed by all the countries involved. And a couple of months later, on the 24th of October, it came into force, the date we now mark as the UN's birthday. Today, the United Nations consists of 193 countries and has accomplished a lot of the things it first set out to do. It's managed by the Security Council, which is made up by 5 permanent members: France, Britain, the United States, China, and Russia. They're in charge of helping countries resolve conflicts.
I now give the floor to the Secretary.
To help make any decisions, the UN holds a General Assembly, which is overseen by this guy, Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General. It's held every year in September at New York headquarters. A lot of people are invited to speak there, and it's given many people, not just politicians, a platform to have their voice heard.
Pay full attention to what the youth is asking here.
Even Beyoncé has belted out a ballad for the assembly. You sure were, Beyoncé, you sure were. The United Nations now has a bunch of specialised agencies, like the World Health Organization and UNICEF, which helps to improve the lives of kids, especially those in disadvantaged areas. While it all sounds pretty good, the organisation has some critics who say the United Nations isn't as effective as it should be, that it favours some countries over others, and that it spends way too much money to operate. But over the weekend, as the UN turned 75, lots of people helped celebrate what it has accomplished and what it can still achieve.
Right, so as you can see, the UN is not 75, the UN is 80, so that was an old video. So my guest today is none other than Professor to me, Professor to the rest of you, Mukesh Kapila. He is the former United Nations official and humanitarian. But more importantly, he is somebody that has seen the UN from the inside out and from the outside in. Prof, welcome again to Borderlines.
Thank you. I'm delighted to join you again.
I'm fabulously delighted and honored to have you. You heard that, and I'm sure you were thinking, in fact, let me ask you, what were you thinking when you heard us play that 3 minutes short snippet of the history of the UN?
Well, I was thinking of my visit to San Francisco a few years ago. I'm not old enough to have been there at the founding of the UN. I hasten to
Of course
add.
not.
But I visited San Francisco a few years ago, and I went to the place where there is a very simple monument, a granite stone, and it's a little park and traffic flows all around it. And, you know, I felt compelled to bow down and kiss the ground, a bit like what the Pope used to do when he went to a country. Because I had a huge sense of reverence to be on the spot where, in the horrors of the Second World War, the leaders at the time somehow had enough hope for the future to come together and plan a better world. So I literally bent down and kissed the ground in front of the monument.
And today, here we are. We have wars. We have an ongoing genocide. In actual fact, let me start with this before we unpack the UN. Franchesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur, who has been investigating the rights abuse in Palestine, has been sanctioned by the United States, literally for doing the job that the UN employed her to do. Talk to us about that.
Well, I think she's a very courageous person, and as a UN office holder, incidentally, she's not a staff member. She is under a special human rights provision. She was doing what she thinks right, and she's saying what she thinks right, and for that she has got sanctioned. But then this is really fairly normal, isn't it? I mean, I got nearly thrown out of the Sudan. In fact, I was thrown out of the Sudan, except I didn't want to give the Sudanese government of another genocidal maniac, the president of that time, al-Bashir, the pleasure of throwing me out. So I left 24 hours before he would. And similarly, we have the International Criminal Court that has been sanctioned. And we're talking about the United States, but actually, other countries also, when they get angry with UN personnel doing their job, calling it as it is, to kind of lash out. So this, I think, I consider a mark of success. That if you're annoying someone as a UN functionary, and you're annoying someone by speaking some form of truth to that power, well, you're doing your job.
Indeed, she has been doing her job, and she just issued another report, which again just shocks you and stops you in your track, which connects the business of what, the business, the wider business world, especially the tech world, to the genocide that's going on in Gaza. Now, this is the thing. You said the United States. The UN has a Security Council. You have United States, Russia, China, France, and the UK, I think, if memory serves me right. So it is that those people one would expect, or those countries one would expect, because they're in the Security Council, they're level higher than everybody else, than everybody in the General Assembly. Therefore, they have a higher responsibility and accountability and should assure that the world stays the way it's supposed to stay, at the very least, be balanced in their behavior. But we haven't seen that. So of what point is actually the UNSC?
Well, I think it was in San Francisco we were talking about earlier, where this charter was agreed that agreed to a very special role for some kind of executive committee of the member states. There were 51 founders at that time, and that's what we call the Security Council, and it gives them a very special role and responsibility as well as privileges. Nothing happens in the world without the approval of these 5 states. And in return, these 5 states are supposed to act in the collective global good. Now, of course, that's the ideal. And we can be cynical now, but let us not be cynical about history. The fact is that when this arrangement came about, the world was in an awful place. And for all the history that I have read, the founders, including the same countries that are there in the Security Council now, except Russia has replaced the Soviet Union, they were really suitably sobered up by the World War. And I think their intentions were genuinely honorable ones. And remember that most countries at the time, not most countries, but many countries at the time were still under colonial systems, including, I believe, Nigeria. So what that means is that the UN, including the Security Council, was started with good intentions. And those intentions remain as perpetual as those days. But what's happened since then is that more countries have joined the club. The number of diverse interests have grown, and therefore the architecture, a very slimline architecture that was agreed in 1945, is no longer able to cope with the context of today. So yes, we can vilify the Security Council, we can slag off all the permanent members and so forth, but I think that is just a symptom of a much greater structural problem we have in the way we govern the world as we find ourselves in now. And I think that needs to be unpacked as much as trying to find a bogeyman, in this case, the Security Council.
So while we can't find the bogeyman, and you're right, we mustn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Everything needs tidying up. Everything can be rebuilt. We don't necessarily need to crucify it. You've talked of your experience in Darfur, where it was you who informed the world that, look, this is going on. You are all blind, or you're turning away. Wake up. And then we have the likes of Franchesca Albanese. I can't say it, because if I say it, I'm not important. I'm not an expert. I'm not employed by, at least contracted by the UN. Now, we've had Srebrenica. We've had Rwanda. We've had so many repetitive atrocities that qualify as genocide. And we're watching one right now. What is the point, again, I ask, of this UN Security Council that can veto what the General Assembly votes for? And therefore, the perpetrators can go scot-free, or at least not be punished.
Well, to be honest, even if the Security Council voted in a different way and allowed action in Palestine or other places, on Sudan, for example, it does not mean that perpetrators will suddenly be bound over to appear in court somewhere, the International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court. Unfortunately, that's so. I think, yes, it would be good if there was a clear verdict from the central organs of the United Nations system, which is not just the Security Council, but also the International Court of Justice, the World Court, that were to say, yes, this is genocide, this is not genocide, yes, this is what should happen, this should not happen. But the organs of these of the UN body are themselves composed of the states that are party to the conflicts that are going on in Palestine and in elsewhere. And therefore, before we have to look at where the responsibility lies. It's not the UN's fault that there is atrocious violence going on in Gaza, whether or not it's defined as genocide. It's not the UN's fault that the Sudan is imploding. And what I saw all those years ago is just repeating itself now, and that pains me more than anything else you can imagine. It is the responsibility of the member states, and the naivety of the founders of the UN was that they had no enforcement mechanisms installed in the charter. Now, to be frank with you, I'm not sure how you could put in enforcement powers. After all, the last thing you want is an international police force or an international army. Even if one could construct one, the last thing you want is one of those. So we still, the UN and its norms in its charter, its values, still rely on the values of and the conduct of its member states. And holding those accountable is where the problem lies. So I've got to ask ourselves, whether or not we deserve the UN that our founders created. Or is it our own misbehavior that, for goodness sake, the way nations are misbehaving now, they deserve the worst?
You say it as it is. You mentioned, or at least that, the clip we played earlier mentioned international law, and you've also alluded to it. Talk to us and explain to us the United Nations, the ICC, and the ICJ. I'll tell you why I ask this. A friend of mine who is a lawyer, he and I have had many, many arguments where he has said, look, it doesn't matter whether the ICC have ruled against Israel. The fact of the matter is it is toothless, because even if they do their rulings, who exactly is going to carry it out? Like you said, there is no international police. So we have a Netanyahu, we have a Yoav Gallant, who are, if you like, gallivanting all over the place, and there is a warrant. And then you have a Karim Khan, who can't do pretty much anything because there are sanctions, and now they've added Franchesca Albanese to that. So where's the teeth? How do they join UN, ICC, ICJ?
The question is, and this is a philosophical question, which I'm not sure is of much comfort to people actually suffering on the ground, but I'll say it anyway. I think it's not the teeth that are important, but the eyes and the mouth nowadays. Why I say that? Now, poor Franchesca, she's suffering, the worst suffering she's going to have is that she can't visit the United States. Well, there are worse things that can happen to a person. Here's the progress that we have made in the UN system. In my time, in 20 odd years ago, when I, as the head of the United Nations, spoke up against the genocide unfolding in Darfur, I was separated from the UN, from my job, okay? And the UN did not back me up. And I was transferred and I ended up somewhere else, but I was not backed up. And this was, Kofi Annan was the Secretary General at that time. Rest in peace. Today, Franchesca speaks up. The whole world condemns what the United States is doing, and the UN backs her up. Now, that to me is progress in the UN system, where before certainly of the UN would close their eyes, hear no evil, see no evil, and certainly speak nothing, and suddenly avert your eyes. Today, UN officials of all shapes and sizes and ranks are saying it as it is, and they're paying a price for it very often. It's not necessarily improving the situation on the ground, but the fact that people who under the UN Charter have a duty to uphold the norms and values of the Charter, which incidentally, if your listeners have not read it, they should go to the internet. The first words of it are, "We the peoples." So these officials, like Albanese, representing we the peoples, are saying what she has said, right? Now, that to me is an infinitely more important thing in terms of progression of the UN's mandate than whatever punitive measure you could take. Yes, of course, I would like criminals to appear in international courts and such like. But you know that's not going to happen under the current geopolitics. So that doesn't mean that we sit there and wring our hands and say, oh dear, and such like. You know, people speak up, and they're speaking up with more and more courage, and they're paying the cost for doing so. But of course, you see, standing up and being courageous is never cost-free. So I welcome the fact that more and more people are having the courage to stand up and say things. And whether or not the world listens in the short term, I am pessimistic about. But whether it will in the long term, I am a little bit more optimistic about in terms of changing global mores.
You've spoken of the backroom deals that nobody hears about, that we don't see, that the ordinary people, the likes of us, we never get to hear. If we could actually peep through, the pigeonhole, what would we see? What would shock us?
I think we would see deals being done, and in my time, in both within the UN system and as a representative of a Security Council country at the UN and its different organizations, where I was part of deal making, either at the receiving end or at the other end, you would see compromises being made. You would see discussions which will start off on matters of principle, and then you would see nations and agencies of the UN settling for something that gives something to somebody and other things to others, in an attempt to find some kind of way of moving forward. Not perfect, and sometimes fatally flawed, as we have seen in many resolutions of the General Assembly. You mentioned the will of the General Assembly, the world's peoples, but quite honestly, some of the General Assembly resolutions are rubbish. Because they're rubbish, because the General Assembly can easily pass a resolution. It doesn't have to actually do anything in terms of imposing. Member states pass resolutions left, right, and center before they go to dinner in the evening. They pass 5 resolutions, means nothing. So my point I'm saying is that all this fora in which the world gets together in the UN, in its different committees and organizations, are important locations for dialogue and exchange of views and such like. Inevitably, that results in suboptimal things, suboptimal conclusions, which very often, unfortunately, lays the problem of future problems. Right. We see that, for example, in Palestine.
Yeah.
We have the UN General Assembly that created the resolution on Palestine all those years ago, soon after the UN was founded. To be honest, it's one of the oldest resolutions there is. But what has it done? It has meant that an UNRWA refugee, a refugee under the mandate of UNRWA, has less rights than a refugee under the mandate of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Because a UNHCR refugee has a right to resettlement in a third country, a right to return, a right to all sorts of things. While an UNRWA refugee has only one right, to return to a Palestine which doesn't exist. And you can pass as many resolutions you like in the General Assembly recognizing Palestine, and this is just fake promises which are not fulfilled. So you understand that those who represent countries in the most important global fora of the world often act in the short-term political interest without recognizing the negative consequences of what they decide as much as any positive decisions that they make for the future.
I have to say, excuse me, what you've just said about the difference, I'd never thought about it, and I'm pretty sure many people don't think about it, the difference between UNRWA and the UNHCR refugee. So is UNRWA then a trap for the Palestinians, so to speak? Because when we speak about it, the two-state solution, I remember one of the, I think we had this conversation the last time you were here, one of the first UN workers to resign at the beginning of this genocide. And I always remembered what he said during his interview with one of the big networks. He said, look, the two-state solution was like a joke that's in the back of the library. Is that why the two-state solution no longer is actually never going to happen? And we just need to be courageous enough to say, look, UNRWA might not be good for these Palestinians because the two-state solution, the second state that UNRWA thinks will happen, is no longer in existence.
Well, UNRWA has had many, many problems. We can go into that. But coming to your core point, really, yes, I think it was a very bad resolution of the 1940s, an open-ended resolution that gave an ideal of a two-state solution. And it meant that the people of Palestine are essentially imprisoned. They're imprisoned within the occupied territories and Gaza, which is under Israeli control, or they're incarcerated in refugee camps in Lebanon and Jordan and Syria in the past. And I've been to see some of them myself in the past, and I was totally shocked. Now, if you happen to be a Sudanese refugee from Darfur, and you know how much of an interest I take in that, if you manage to survive and get out into Chad or South Sudan, you could end up anywhere in the world quite happily. While what happens with the Palestinian refugees under the UNRWA mandate, countries are not giving them right to settle, not even their brothers and sisters in the rest of the Gulf, which are speaking so loudly in Palestinian solidarity, because if they were to do that, then the Palestinians would not return and therefore not be able to make what they call a state of Palestine, which is not going to happen in my lifetime at least, and it might happen in yours because you look younger than me. However, my point here is that it's like going to church and you pay lip service to the values and norms of church or mosque or wherever you go to, and then you carry on with your normal life. So all the posturing that is going on at the present time on the peace process the UN is fairly marginal to that. Nobody's thought of the UN as part of the peace process on Palestine. Who's going to ask the UN to do that? Really, they're completely marginalized. But they're all about referring to some kind of mythical two-state solution, knowing full well that ain't going to happen anytime soon. And meanwhile, the suffering of the poor people of Gaza and the occupied territories is getting from bad to worse. So we're not discussing Palestine here, but it's to illustrate the point about faulty decisions made by collective UN membership. And the decision makers then walk away, and the successors then have to scratch their heads and see how we are to implement it. So my response looking forward is to say, please, let's get rid of resolutions which are no longer valid or no longer implementable, and let's move on. And yet what we have in the UN system is a whole library full of resolutions right from day one, in both the Security Council, the General Assembly, the economic and social thing, plus decisions of the International Court of Justice, not to say the ICC, which is not a UN system thing, but it's associated. And so students can study all these resolutions, but they're completely unimplementable. Now, this is not a place on which to build the next 80 years of our collective effort under the UN system.
So who's gonna change it? I mean, because what I'm hearing from you is, it would appear, and do correct me if I'm wrong, all these resolutions continue to keep UN agencies going, which is keeping people employed. Perhaps what needs to happen, and also, if I may extend it, allows governments, state governments, sovereign nations to be lazy, to be lazy about sorting out what's going on in their backyard, what's going on in their homes or in their countries. So who's going to fix this? How, obviously, like you said, we can't have another 80 years. We might get to 100, but something clearly needs to be done.
Well, I think 2 points you're making, I think, to be taken separately. Firstly, about UN agencies. There are about 30-odd main UN agencies, and they employ about 130,000 people, and they have a few billions in their budget. I've got the numbers here. And quite honestly, we live in $1 trillion world, and this is peanuts. So I know there's a lot of rhetoric about inefficient UN agencies, and I myself have contributed to that criticism in my own debates on this subject. But honestly, it's small cheese. The UN agencies are small cheese compared to the big problems of the world, and their staff, 130,000, are peanuts compared to what the countries employ, even what some states or what some cities employ in terms of their administration, not to speak about their hundreds of billions of budgets. I think the UN agencies discharge what the masters tell them. And what the masters tell them are the member states who have passed various resolutions setting up the constitutions of these bodies, whether it's the World Health Organization or the UNHCR or UNICEF or anyone else. And they allocate funds, and then they go and do what they have to do. We can come back to that in a minute. Now, in terms of member states, problem for member states is some of these problems are just not soluble at a global level. I mean, India and Pakistan, India, my country of birth, and Pakistan, from where my ancestors came before they migrated to India. They've been at loggerheads ever since independence in 1947, right? And sitting in Kashmir are a bunch of UN observers, peace observers. I don't know how many millions they cost each year, but quite honestly, a complete and utter waste of space and time, and most importantly, money. There are 11 peacekeeping operations around the world costing about $4 billion. That's actually not a lot, considering the trillion world we live in. But having said that, it just shows you that the UN cannot find solutions to these things. Okay, it is not the job of the UN to solve the problems between India and Pakistan. It is not the problem of the UN to find the solution between the problems of Israeli people, and the Palestinian people. Yes, in a kind of grand philosophical sense, you can argue that, but it's an easy answer, right? The solution to the problem of India, Pakistan, or
Palestine and Israel,
or Sudan, for that matter, or South Sudan, will be found by the direct stakeholders involved in those particular crises. So I think this idea of globalizing every problem and trying to find a solution for it by everybody getting involved in it, and by putting in an envelope called the UN or some multilateral body, I think is just a diversionary tactic. It's a time-wasting tactic. It is also certainly a money-wasting tactic. And in all of this, the suffering of the people directly affected gets even worse. So my short answer is the UN must withdraw from many of these situations where it has little added value, and it should remain a moral force in the world. It should remain the people like Albanese shouting and saying what's going right and wrong here and there, or people like Tedros at the World Health Organization saying, hey, let's get together and work together to protect ourselves against future pandemics. So absolutely right, these people should shout from their pulpits on that area, but that's where they should be. And then whether or not problems are solved, whether problems of poverty and pandemics or problems of peace and security, relies entirely and directly on the stakeholders involved. And that means those who are directly fighting each other and those who are supporting the vested interests that are also involved. Because today, no fighting or no insecurities between just two people, A and B, country A and country B. There's usually a bunch of stakeholders who are profiting from it or benefiting from the insecurity, or even from the benefiting from the poverty, if you're talking about social and economic issues. So I think in that context, on the 80th anniversary, the vision required is not just to cut down all the budgets as is happening because of all the aid cuts that are going on, and they will get even worse, but to actually completely re-envision the role of a global body 80 years after its foundation in a world which is very different from the world of where San Francisco was 80 years ago.
Indeed. So who pays? Who pays? How does the UN, Nigeria is a member. in fact, it's curious. Nigeria is a member. I think we have, I've forgotten her title now. We don't hear anything from her. I don't know whether that's the same for other countries where, they have their General Assembly representative and you don't hear anything from them. And often people, when they have what they believe is a big human rights issue that the rep should bring on, our representative, her name will come to me now, was actually called out recently saying, look, we're writing to the UN. We expect you to take this on. We expect you to bring this to the assembly, but we're not hearing anything. So is it a case of, presidents of these countries are able to quash and make sure that these things are not debated? Or is it that we just don't see the ones that, we don't see the smaller ones, if you like. We only see the big ones. Yeah, her name is Amina Mohammed. She's Deputy Secretary General. That's it.
Sure, of course. And a very respected lady at that. Now, let me give you a direct answer through an indirect route. And we start at the beginning. The UN Charter, the opening words of it is, we the peoples. Now tell me, where are the peoples in the UN? There are none, okay? Now, if you look at Nigeria, if you look at my own country of birth, India, or my country of my adoption, the United Kingdom, for all their successes and weaknesses and problems and contradictions, they have parliaments, good or bad, ups and downs. We, the peoples, get a say in we are governments. And at the UN, there is no we, the peoples. What the nations of the world have done is made sure that the we, the peoples, don't get on the plane to New York. And everything is decided by unelected diplomats. So you might argue, well, actually, the government of Nigeria or the government of India, decides on the foreign policy and is accountable for that to your parliament, and they have made the administration which sends a permanent representative to the UN and all those kinds of. You could do that. You could say that, but what that has meant, that system of relating to the UN has meant that we, the people, have got more and more distant from the institutions of the UN. There is no democracy in the UN. So before we complain about the Security Council and say, oh, well, it is unrepresentative of the world as it exists today, well, let's start off with the rest of the UN structure, including the General Assembly. It is not representative of we the peoples at all, right? And this democracy deficit is responsible for why the UN lacks credibility today. It is not simply because the UN is inefficient or it's failing to deliver on its values and promises, or all those Kenyan policemen are in Haiti, and unfortunately the people of Haiti are still suffering, and the poor Kenyans are, I don't know what they're doing, running around being targeted. And so we blame then, we then blame the UN police, the Kenyans, for doing that, right? So my point here is this: and you asked, what do we do? Unless and then we have people like Franchesca Albanese, individuals having to shout from the rooftops and be sanctioned, right? Because she doesn't have we the peoples behind her. She's not an official of we the peoples. She's an official of the UN human rights function, which is a bureaucratic function of the system.
Right.
So she's unprotected, other than the solidarity of her own colleagues and long that may be. So my point here is, for Nigerians, you asked about your Nigerian representative. Well, I would say, how is Nigeria dealing with its domestic problems, and how is Nigeria dealing with the problems of its neighborhood? And if you were to only do that properly, as, for example, you were trying to do when Nigerian peacekeepers were in Liberia and Sierra Leone, and I was there with ECOWAS, working alongside ECOMOG, part of
ECOMOG. Yeah.
All these
ECO. Yeah.
And then imagine if each major power, like Nigeria in West Africa, others elsewhere, played a responsible role in their neighborhood and said, okay, this we must first solve ourselves before asking the African Union to come in or the UN to come in, then I think the world would be a much better place, and the UN a less toxic place on which to have this, where to have these arguments. So my indirect answer is we need greater democracy in the UN. We need, for example, what the European Union has done. You know, the EU was created and there was a European Commission, and then people in Europe got say, oh, what are these bureaucrats doing sitting in Brussels? And the gap between Brussels and the member states was separating, and you could see the European project failing. Well, it failed in Britain, unfortunately, but, more generally. And so
Margaret Thatcher knew it would fail, but go ahead.
Yeah, and so they made a European Parliament, right? And the European Parliament has injected democracy within the European Union, the most advanced and successful multilateral project in history of modern times, whatever its other faults might be, and there are many of them. So I think on the 80th anniversary, what we have to reflect on is not bureaucratic changes, not endless debate on Security Council reform, which is completely meaningless and irrelevant. It's not going to happen. And in any case, even if it happens, the new permanent members of the Security Council aren't going to behave any better than the old ones. And I don't think the General Assembly has got much to talk about either. They're not exactly saints either. But I think if you can inject we the peoples into the UN architecture in some way of representing we the peoples and bringing democracy, then we might move forward. It'll be chaotic. How do you have we the peoples represented from all over the world in we the UN? I mean, there are many ways.
Problems. Yeah,
many technical ways of doing it, and I think we can discuss that in some program. But I think injecting democracy into the UN must be the key issue for the 80th anniversary, and the key subject for the new Secretary General in a couple of years' time, and the other senior leadership that is being renewed of many UN agencies over the next couple of years.
You can call now. Sorry, I couldn't pick up. I needed to hear. Look, you're not the only one learning from Prof. I am also learning from him. So you can all call now. I can pick up your call 0201-277-0993, 0201-465-7190. Send your WhatsApp to 0809-597-5805, and they're calling. You get 30 seconds because we don't have time. Hello.
Come back from work immediately. I go to my PC and I start gaming, even though I'm so tired. But I just want to have a little bit of space that I have, and just to let it go with gaming and just like reveal all my feelings.
I don't know where we are. I can't hear you. I don't know what I'm listening to. Hello? Oh dear. Okay. Hello?
Good evening, Sisiogi.
Good evening.
Emmanuel, I'm speaking to you from Ekwe.
Yes, go ahead, Emmanuel. 30 seconds.
I remember Kofi Annan invited George Bush and then nothing was done about it. And
Kofi Annan invited Judge Bush to do what?
So, indicted.
Oh, indicted him. Yes.
Yes. And the early days of the war between Russia and Ukraine, the UN Secretary General was in Ukraine. And right inside there, when there was, Russians sent missiles, to the town he was.
I need you to wrap up. We don't have time at all. Yeah.
Now, where do we go from here? Should we abolish the Secretary General office, or that is of the UN, and what should be the replacement? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's a frank question. I like it. I'm coming to you, Prof. 1 second. Hello.
Good evening.
Good evening. Very quickly, Koboko, 30 seconds. Do not shout. Be very clear.
The genocide that is happening in Palestine, is it more than the one that happened in Nigeria?
Honestly, if you are going to call, please make sure you've been listening to the show. Hello? Hello?
Yeah, this is okay. Good evening. How are you doing?
Good evening. I'm very well, thank you.
Number one, I think I agree partially. Okay.
We need you to speak up, Titi Lokpa. We need you to speak up, please.
Okay, I agree partially with him, but I don't agree with the fact that UN is unnecessary. Because without the UN, the world will be much worse than it is right now.
I don't think he said it's unnecessary. He didn't say it's unnecessary.
He said, no. The UN is very, very necessary.
Yeah.
But there must be a rejigging. The reason is that, when there was end of colonization, the imperialists, the imperial master came together with the support of America to form the United Nations. In other words, to form neo-colonialism. And that is why he's talking about the democracy aspect of it. But the truth is that, for instance, he mentioned Nigeria.
I need you to wrap up, Titi Lokpa. I don't have time. Sorry.
Yes, I'm saying what you're saying.
Okay.
The UN is still better, but must be refined than it is right now. Otherwise, the world will be worse than it is right now.
Thank you.
But I know UN is not doing the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Titi Lokpa makes an interesting, or at least drops part of his words interesting. Is the UN an extension of colonization? I think that's what he was trying to say. I might be putting words in his mouth, but I think that's what he's trying to say. And we have 1 minute, 2 minutes? 2 minutes. Yes, go ahead, Prof.
Have I got 2 minutes?
Less than 1.5 now.
Remember the history of the UN. It was formed in the aftermath of the Second World War, where most countries were still colonies, right? And remember also that in the 1960s, a lot of UN peacekeeping missions and various special representatives had like viceroy powers. For example, Sergio Vieira de Mello in East Timor, and I was with him, he was like a viceroy of East Timor. Or, for example, the EU special representative with UN and the UN authority also in Bosnia, still to this present day. But the UN's form of colonialism is not toxic like the old racist form of colonialism. So, and there's something called the Trusteeship Council, which is part of the UN Charter, which gives them the ability to do that. I think, for example, Gaza should be under the Trusteeship Council in the future, if anyone ever goes there. So the short answer is don't blame colonialism for today's problems, whether it's the historical colonial powers or whether it's the UN in its quasi oversight role.
So he said, I think it was Emmanuel that said, should Antonio Guterres be sacked? Is there any point? What it means is there any points to a UN Secretary General? We have 30 seconds.
There's no need to sack Antonio Guterres because he's going next year, I think, anyway.
And that's even more worrying. We have a German possibly coming through. Prof, you've got to come back. We haven't finished our discussion. I'm so sorry. You need to come back.
Okay.
And I get this is where we will catch from. We need to talk about the appointment of the Secretary Generals, etc.
Sure, by all means. Are you standing for it? They need a woman. They said that. I think the pressure to get a woman is very strong, and so you should seriously consider. Why not? We the people.
We the people. Thank you so much, Professor Mukesh Kapila. There you go. That's the end of another Borderlines. I may just be standing for UN Secretary General. Thank you, Prof. God bless you.
Thank you.
We'll be calling you back because it's the 80th anniversary is not till October. So we want to be doing it quite a bit so that people will learn as we build up to that.
Absolutely. Look forward to discussing further.
Thank you so much, sir. Have a wonderful weekend. Take care.
Bye. Even for porridge or spaghetti, cook to impress with Pepper Terra.
99.3 Nigeria Info. We are more than just radio. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Nigeria Info FM. Check us out on Facebook at Nigeria Info 99.3. Follow us on Twitter at Nigeria Info FM and on Instagram at Nigeria Info FM Lagos for live updates as it happens. 99.3